Hello. We are here for Zero Books Basement, discussing capital. And today we are going to be doing from Capital Chapter 20, Time Wages. And it's important to keep in mind when it comes to this title, Time Wages, that the next chapter, Chapter 21, is going to be entitled Peace Wages. So what this refers to is the distinction between the payment of labor based on time units and the payment of labor based on the furnishing of units of value, right? Not in the form of materials, right? So, you know, you deliver X number of newspapers, ergo you get paid a certain amount. I mean, it also indexes to time, but time is not the direct instrument of the measurement in that case. So it's important that we set these chapters beside each other when we consider this. And today we have, of course, Eliot Rosenstock, internationally acclaimed author of Zizek in the Clinic, a wonderful technical manual for psychoanalysis. We have Ernesto Vargas, one of the young guns here at Zero Books, Mexico's finest. And we hope that he's going to be contributing a little bit to our upcoming work. And myself, Conrad Hamilton, co-author of What is Postmodern Conservatism, along with Matt McManus and others. And what was the name of my other book? Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson. There we go. So I think, you know, a good thing we were talking about is maybe reading some of this aloud, but I want to ask you guys before we get into this, what are your initial thoughts on the chapter?
Well, I really see this chapter, you know, this is supposed to be written in 1840, I think. Yeah, ish. 1840-ish.
No.
1880s? Oh, no.
No. Well, Marx,
whatever.
Okay. Yeah. Later. I think it would, like, I'm not sure the exact dates that Marx wrote. So Capital came out in what year? Was it 1867? What was the original?
Says here.
Capital Volume 1 release date was, 1867. That's correct.
It was a good year. Good year for dropping
Right.
Capital.
Right.
Do you think that there's numerological significance between the civil rights movement and Marx's Capital, 1867, 1967? I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, it came out the same year that Canada was founded, by the way. So.
Oh yeah. So.
Okay.
Big things happening.
This is why I am teleologically destined to be the next great Marxist thinker. Okay. So yeah, this was 1867. So actually, this is one thing, and I've mentioned this before, but you have to remember about Capital is that Capital Volume 1, of course, comes chronologically first, right? And was published first before the other volumes of Capital, but it was actually written after.
Yeah.
So much of what was assembled into the volumes 2 and 3, those are sort of like drafts, right? Then Marx went back and took, you know, the sort of draft work you had. I don't know the exact history, but I'm trying to piece it out here. He took, I think, some of the draft work he had for Capital Volume 1 and turned it into a refined volume based on all the other work he'd done. And that was published. But then Engels cobbled together things that were written earlier for 2 and 3. And I believe that's the case for theories of surplus value as well. So I think the actual contents of Capital Volume 1 that we know were written a few years before its publication, like 1863, around there.
Yeah. This chapter is important, though, because I think Marx really comes through with the necessity of dialectical thinking and the necessity of critique in terms of when you kind of countering the capitalistic solution-based, resolved kind of style of thinking, where it's like, oh, labor has a complaint, ergo we have this method to satiate labor's complaint, like but he sort of follows the logic of the capitalist solutions to various labor complaints and shows how they're not actually solutions, but sort of obfuscations of the initial tendency of the capitalist to accumulate capital, and the drop of wage labor, and then the appearance in these things such as overtime, and then other such obfuscations, or as I think, Conrad, you said you wanted to read through it. So as we read through it, it starts right at the beginning, Marx's critique of, I guess, traditional analysis. So should I read it through? Do you want to read it?
Maybe not like the whole chapter, but maybe we should start with the 4th paragraph, because I just want to try to get through some of the technical stuff. So the sum of money, you want to start with that? So page in the folks.
Yeah. I see it. I wonder if there was something before that.
Well, he's talking about chapter 7.
Let me read the first part really quick, and then I'll skip.
Okay, sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So this is how the chapter starts.
Yep.
Wages themselves, again, take many forms, a fact not recognizable in ordinary economic treatises which exclusively interested in the material side of the question. Interesting that Marx says that one of his critiques is that ordinary economic treatises are exclusively interested in the material side of the question. So neglect every difference of form. So there's a difference of form which he expands upon in this chapter.
The value form, yeah.
An exposition of these forms, however, belongs to the special study of wage labor, not therefore to this work. Still, the two fundamental forms must be briefly worked out here. And then he talks about the sale of labor power, which takes place for a definite period of time, and the value of labor power, that is time wages. Okay, so I think that's important to not glance over and just sort of move into these very dense ideas of, the mathematics of capital. So that's sort of what we're doing here, expanding on these different forms. So, okay, the sum of money which the laborer receives for his daily or weekly labor forms the amount of his nominal wages or of his wages estimated in value. But it is clear that according to the length of the working day, that is, according to the amount of actual labor daily supplied, the same daily or weekly wage may represent very different prices of labor, i.e. very different sums of money for the same quantity of labor. So just to stop there, it's important to say, so even if two people are making the same amount of money, it doesn't necessarily mean that those amounts of money are equal, because say if somebody's working 12 hours in a factory grinding marble, and another person is, say, working in a law firm for 4 hours, and they make the same amount of money, right? But one works a third as much as the other person, that they're not actually receiving the same amount, even though the money the sum of money is the same. So, okay. We must therefore, in considering time wages, again distinguish between the sum total of the daily or weekly wages and the price of labor. How then to find this price, i.e. the money value of a given quantity of labor? The average price of labor is found when the average daily value of the labor power is divided by the average number of hours in the working day. If, e.g., the daily value of labor power is 3 shillings, the value of the product of 6 working hours, and if the working day is 12 hours, the price of 1 working hour is 3/12 shillings, equals 3D. The price of the working hour thus found serves as a unit of measure for the price of labor. Okay. So dialectically speaking here, Marx is arguing, I think this is a very solid argument for the labor theory of value in terms of measuring what somebody is truly getting from wage labor based on the price of the working hour, rather than their sum total that they take home at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, the problem is this gets all blown to smithereens by like the complexities and like the equivocation between value and price that are introduced in the 3rd volume of Capital. So he uses like very, very tidy mathematical formulas to deduce these things here, but they're not consistent with the presentation he adopts elsewhere in the material, which gets us into like the transformation problem and some of the core difficulties of maintaining a labor theory of value. Like it works here for very simple purposes, but actually trying to understand capitalism is way more complex than this, because like again here, right? If we look at what he's saying here, he's assuming like a fairly direct correlation between price of labor and value of labor. But if you have the redistribution of profits amongst like different kind of enterprises based on the organic composition of capital, that's going to completely change that measurement, right? So we've said before, like The service industry, which is we say low organic composition of capital or labor being performed in China, that's necessary to actually transfer wealth or profits to sectors that have a higher organic composition of capital or more dependent on technological apparatuses, right, to augment the profits that are received there. So I think that's just something to note.
Okay. So Conrad, do you want to continue? Should I continue the next paragraph?
I'm really liking. Are we okay with letting Eliot? Because I really like how you're going here, and you're kind of stopping.
Please.
All right. So it follows, therefore, that the daily and weekly wages, and so on, may remain the same, although the price of labor falls consistently. If, e.g., the habitual working day is 10 hours and the daily value of the labor power 3 shillings, the price of the working hour is 3 3/5 days. It falls to 3 days as soon as the working day rises to 12 hours, to 2 2/5 day as soon as it rises to 15 hours. Daily or weekly wages remain, despite all of this, unchanged. On the contrary, the daily or weekly wages may rise, although the price of labor remains constant or even falls. If, e.g., the working day is 10 hours and the daily value of labor power 3 shillings, the price of 1 working hour is 3 3/5 days. If the laborer, in consequence of increase of trade, works 12 hours, the price of labor remaining the same, his daily wage now rises to 3 shillings 7 1/5 day without any variation in the price of labor. So this is important because this sort of reflects real world happenings with jobs in terms of the tendency of the capitalist to push their laborers as far as they can in terms of getting the most productivity out of them. If you've ever experienced this in a job where suddenly you're doing the workload, which Marx talks about later, of like 1.5 people, it's like, oh, I'm doing the job of 1.5 people. Suddenly I'm doing the job of 2 people. Suddenly I'm working X amount unpaid overtime. So it keeps getting pushed and pushed, and your wage might stay the same, but your labor, the price of an hour of your labor is dropping. Okay. So
we should add too that though that's complicated by the shift from absolute surplus value production to relative surplus value production.
Yeah.
So in the early stage of capitalism, it's all about lengthening the working day, whereas later you have to talk about automation as a variable, which changes things a great deal. But yeah, like those tendencies can still exist simultaneously. So he says, like I think a couple chapters ago or in the last chapter, that in the Victorian era in England, there was a strong tendency to lengthen the working day while simultaneously implementing automation on a widespread level.
Yeah, I'm a little salty because this is happening to me currently.
Okay. Yeah.
So I'm hearing the libtard voice come out. My own.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I fucking hate this shit. Okay. All right. So let's see. Where did I stop? The same result might follow if, instead of the extensive amount of labor, its intensive amount increased. The rise of nominal, is that where we're at?
The rise of nominal.
Yeah, the rise of nominal daily or weekly wages may therefore be accompanied by a price of labor that remains stationary or falls. The same holds as to the income of the laborer's family. As soon as the quantity of labor expended by the head of the family is increased by the labor of the members of his family. There are therefore methods of lowering the price of labor independent of the reduction of the nominal daily or weekly wages.
Mm-hmm.
So here he's talking about the size of the surplus labor force. So he talks about like the employment of children and women, right, as being one means through which it's possible to lower the price of labor, right?
Yeah.
Which is really, really important to understanding the whole kind of drive within capitalism. To incorporate more and more individuals who are capable of selling their labor power. But that's actually, the problem with this is that there are things in our economy, like say socially reproductive labor or raising children, that aren't incorporated directly into the capitalist economy in most cases. And so as a consequence, this creates a tension because you have to leave, some space, right? Or individuals or whatever to do that. But at the same time, there's a drive
Conrad, can you answer this question Daniel has? Is it the price of labor or the price of labor power?
There are therefore methods of lowering the price of labor which are independent of any reduction of the nominal daily or weekly wage. I mean, he's saying labor here, but I think he means labor power. Okay. Like, I think it's just a shorthand, right? Because like he says, like value for like exchange value.
All right.
Well, by reducing the price of labor power, you reduce the price of labor in this case.
Yeah. So there's a connection.
All right. There. So let's keep going.
I mean, there is no labor for Marx like in capitalism in that way, right? Like that wouldn't be that wouldn't be the economic basis of discussing it, right? Because like labor power, like if you're selling labor power, you're selling like the capacity of someone to labor over a certain duration on a speculative basis.
Yeah.
Right. So there's no direct interchange with labor as such, right? So he wants to be a bit more specific, right? To try to create categories that lend themselves to the exposition of how surplus value is extracted.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So let's continue a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
As a general law, it follows that given the amount of daily or weekly labor, etc., the daily or weekly wages depend on the price of labor, which itself varies either with the value of labor power or with the difference between its price and value. Given, on the other hand, the price of labor, the daily or weekly wages depend on the quantity of the daily or weekly labor. And I'll do a quick spoiler alert for the end of the chapter. One of the problems is there becomes a sort of tendency of capitalists to then compete who can recapture the value of labor the most and create more and more unpaid labor, and the tendency of labor power to sort of diminish because of the capitalist tendency to compete with other capitalists to pay less labor or to pay to recapture value, you could say. Yeah. So okay, Conrad.
Okay. However, as a general law, it follows that given the amount of the unit of measurement for time wages, the price of the working hour, is the value of a day's labor power divided by the number of hours in the average working day. Let the latter be 12 hours and the daily value of labor power 3 shillings, the value product of 6 hours of labor. Under these circumstances, the price of a working hour is 3D and the value produced in it is 6D. If the worker is now employed for less than 12 hours a day, or for less than 6 days in the week, for instance, only for 6 or 8 hours, he receives, at the price of labor just mentioned, only 2 shillings, or 1 shilling. 6D a day. As on our hypothesis, he must work on average 6 hours a day in order to produce a day's wage, which corresponds to nothing more than the value of his labor power. And as, on the same hypothesis, he works only half of every hour for himself and half for the capitalist, it is clear that he cannot obtain for himself the value product of 6 hours if he's employed for less than 12 hours. In previous chapters, we saw the destructive consequence of overwork. But here we come upon the origin of the sufferings which arise for the worker out of his being insufficiently employed. Right? So if I understand properly what he's saying here, the value of a day's labor, what he's saying here is that in the value produced, what he's talking here is about, I guess, what we call underemployment, right? So it isn't a situation where the actual, because like one of the things here, for example, you have like the law of subsistence, right? In which like you have to pay workers like enough for them to live or to meet their needs, which are differentiated depending on the state of the economy. So like if the actual normative working day has not been diminished, right? Legally, for example, or if it's not been reduced, then if it's 12 hours, for example, and you're only working 6 hours, then you're only going to have half of what you need to live, right? On that basis, right? Or not half of what you need, but half the average value of labor power, right?
Yeah.
From that context, right? Which there is a relationship with social need as well, right? Is that how you read it, Ernesto?
Yeah.
I think part of something to keep in mind is while Marx sort of employs this example where the capitalist is taking half of the labor, that's by no means a fixed amount, and it fluctuates, and then the tendency is the capitalist to take more and more and more of that. I think the idea that people in modernity are getting half of the value of labor, I know I'm not getting anywhere near half of the value of what is recaptured by my labor, for instance. Yeah.
Right.
So that's just something to note.
The price of labor, okay, just Daniel L. Jacobs, I'm looking at his comments. The price of labor is the sum paid for a given quantity of labor. Okay, so he's helping differentiate these terms for us.
Yeah.
So labor is talking about okay, so he's differentiating like the classical political economy notion of value of labor with labor power, which furnishes a surplus value, right? That's the wages of labor depend upon the price of labor. Okay. For the wage appears to be the price of labor, even though you cannot sell your labor, you sell your labor power. Yeah, so labor power has an added value above and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's the distinction. So actually, it's quite confusing. But when he uses labor, like he's not talking about labor in the metaphysical abstract. He's talking about its particular use of the particular way that category is used within capital, like classical political economy and sort of the ideology of capitalism, right?
Would it be fair to say its instrumental element of labor is labor power?
Well, labor power is actually a physical capacity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So labor power is just the capacity to.
Okay, so it's just the capacity to labor.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
It's not actually its instrumental use, but rather just the capacity to labor.
Yeah. So again, so his point is that there's a physical capacity to labor, which is not represented by the amount paid to labor.
Okay.
Right. So there's a discrepancy between the payment and the physical capacity. Right. When I say it's a physical capacity, I'm just bracketing some debates about that, but this is like the more clearest, explanation of what Marx gives.
Well, I mean, that's the dialectical materialism, which is we're splitting these terms because when you do split the terms, you get to see the movements of these two elements of labor.
Should I read the next paragraph? We go there?
Yeah, sure.
If the hour's wage is fixed in such a way that the capitalist does not bind himself to pay a day or a week's wage, but only to pay wages for the hours during which he chooses to employ the worker, he can employ him for a shorter time than that which is originally the basis of the calculation of the wages for the hour, or of the unit of measurement of the price of labor. Since this unit is determined by the ratio of the daily value of labor power to the working day of a given number of hours, it naturally loses all meaning as soon as the working day ceases to contain a definite number of hours. The connection between the paid and the unpaid labor is destroyed. The capitalist can now wring from the worker a certain quantity of surplus labor without allowing the labor time necessary for his own subsistence. He can annihilate all regularity of employment, and according to his own convenience, caprice, in the interest of the moment, make the most frightful overwork alternate with relative or absolute cessations of work. He can abnormally lengthen the working day without giving the worker any corresponding compensation under the pretext of paying the normal price of labor. Hence the perfectly rational revolt by the London building workers in 1860 against the attempt of the capitalists to impose on them this sort of wage by the hour. The legal limitation of the working day puts an end to mischievous acts of this kind, though it does not, of course, end the diminution of employment caused by the competition of machinery, by changes in the quality of the workers employed, and partial or general crises. So again, what he's saying is if you have an economy that's regulated based on, you're going to perform, normally this many hours of labor in a week, right? Mm-hmm. That you there's a certain accountability, like vis-a-vis the workers that exists, right? You might be concerned with their subsistence, for example. You're going to be paying them, a certain amount of labor that's necessary for them to reproduce themselves, and then a certain amount for the labor power, right, that they need to reproduce themselves, and then some of it you're going to take that's going to be used to valorize capital, right? Yeah. But of course, if you don't have anything like a consistent temporal structure or structuration of labor, right, then you can say, well, then you don't have to concern yourself anymore with that, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of interesting, right, because it also suggests that, I think in the next chapter in Peace Wages, he calls them the natural apotheosis of capitalist relations. So you can see in a way how there's an aspect in which Marx says of slavery that probably slave owners pay more, right? Two slaves in relation to the value their labor power creates than capitalists do, right? Yeah. And I guess the idea is that, the ratio would be higher in the context of a set number of hours in a week than what he's describing here as time wages. So in a way, this sort of structure of, 40 hours a week, whatever, in a way, you can see this as a kind of stepping stone between slavery and the apotheosis of capitalist relations, which, is perhaps more liberal in its structuration, but, is even more impoverishing with respect to the worker. By the way, Marx doesn't, it's important to clarify because I know people are saying this bullshit now. Marx doesn't say slavery is good. What he says is that he only says very simply that slaves may be paid for a higher proportion of their labor power, the value that creates. But he adds that slavery blows for a number of other reasons.
Yeah, as Justin Murphy would say, not even being controversial. but slaves are compensated. I think it's better than if Marx was tweeting back in the day. But yeah.
Nobody tell. Did Dustin Murphy write about that? Is that what you're saying?
No, but he would on Twitter. He would say not even being controversial, followed by something controversial. That would make.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah. Well, nobody tell him. Nobody tell him that Marx says that slaves are better paid for the value of their labor power. No one tell him that in this moment because he's going to go crazy, right?
Maybe he's following along in Capital and trying to refine his use more Marxist into a more Marxist. Maybe. I mean, I don't.
Anyone can watch us here, no matter how odious your tweets are. We are open to all viewers.
Yeah. I still need to set up that debate between you and him, or the discussion rather, or whatever. Anyway.
Ernesto? Do you want to read a bit?
Sure.
Okay.
With an increase in the daily or weekly wage, the price of labor may remain nominally constant, and yet fall below its normal level. This occurs every time the working day is prolonged beyond its customary length, while the price of labor, reckoned per working hour, remains constant. If, in the fraction daily value of labor power over working day, the denominator increases, the numerator increases still more rapidly. The amount of deterioration in labor power, and therefore its value, increases with the duration of its functioning, and to a more rapid degree than the increase of that duration, which I think we talked about before in previous chapters. Mm-hmm. In many branches of industry where time wages are the general rule and there are no legal limits to the length of the working day, the habit has therefore spontaneously grown up of regarding the working day as normal only up to a point of time. To a point in time. For instance, up to the expiration of the 10th hour, quote, normal working day, or the day's work, or the regular hours of work, unquote. Beyond this limit, the working time is overtime and is paid at a better hourly rate, quote, extra pay, unquote, although often in a proportion which is ridiculously small. Yeah, we see that a lot here in Mexico. The normal working day exists here as a fraction of the actual working day. And over the year, as a whole, the latter is often more common than the former. Yeah. The increase in the price of labor when the working day is extended beyond a certain normal limit takes place in various British industries in such a way that the low price of labor during the so-called normal time compels the worker to work during the better paid overtime if he wishes to obtain a sufficient wage at all. I think I actually mentioned this a couple of discussions ago, that here in Mexico, and I assume in third world countries around the world, most of the people employed in manufacturers must work overtime to cover the costs of daily consumption.
Yeah.
And
the idea of Marx is to not let the fact that you're getting paid like time and a half or whatever it is for overtime obfuscate the fact that there is a sort of quantitative labor power that you're selling, right? So
yeah, correctly.
Yeah, so what he's saying is that, I guess, and he makes this point, and I think this is like the last core point in this chapter, really. But his basic point, like, it's kind of like you're screwed if you do and you're screwed if you don't, right? Because like if you're in a situation where you don't have this kind of more fixed structure and in which hours are sporadic, you're not necessarily going to be receiving the wages you need on a consistent basis to reproduce your labor power, right? But at the same time, it's like if you have overtime, well, maybe the capitalist receives a lower proportion, right, of the value created by labor power in those additional hours. But like they're still taking surplus value from it, right? And that's also, working those kind of days is also going to have deleterious effects in terms of the degradation of labor power and so forth, right? So again, that's and this is partly why, like, it's a kind of like this is part of why they have laws like this, right, in states that have been affected by the organization of labor, right? So the idea that, for example, that you can issue overtime, but it has to be like, I think in Canada, right, it has to be officially anyway, it has to be optional, and you have to pay, I think it's time and a half, right? So part of the idea here is like, well, capitalists can extend, right, exploitation beyond the normal working day, or the normal working week, or whatever it may be. But they have to. They're going to take a legally obligated cut, right?
Yeah,
to the surplus value they're able to extract based on that, and that furthermore that workers are supposed to legally have the ability to turn that down.
Yeah, I mean, in the U.S.,
do they really have the legal ability to turn that down?
Sorry, there's plenty of jobs that where you really can't turn that.
Of course, yeah. I think we should. I understand it's a bit of a hassle to go through the footnote. No, actually, they're right here. So one of the footnotes actually points that out. Says, I'm going to try to find it.
Here, while you're looking for it, just very quickly, no,
go ahead.
Some of the actual differences you could say within American industry is if you go to the airport and you're a baggage handler, you essentially have to work 12-hour days, 6 days a week, versus security agents who are like the higher up security agents, not necessarily TSA pat downers. They work 4 days a week, 10-hour days. So there's this difference in quality of life, and it's based, ultimately it's like, oh, our living standards are comparable, but not really, because one person's working 4 days a week for 10 hours with 8 hours total overtime, time and a half, and the other is working, what is it, 4 times 6, 24 overtime hours, 6 days a week, and they're at the airport sick, all the time.
Yeah,
and that's sort of the you can see class kind of emerge out of that.
Yeah, I know this maybe a stupid example, but I really like that in The Sims. This is the way that the job progression works. It's always less hours for more pay.
Yeah, in The Sims, you're saying?
Yeah. In The Sims.
I've been meaning to get into The Sims, but I haven't.
I think you would like it.
What are you saying about The Sims?
That the job progression, the ladder, it's always less time for better pay.
Okay. Yeah. Well, he talks about this too, right? He says that there's actually something else we should talk about here. I forgot about this, but he talks about this in the chapter, like the way that there's a kind of he goes on, right? There's a sort of vicious cycle, right?
Yeah.
In which what do we say here? But the same circumstances which allow the capitalist in the long run to prolong the working day also allow him at first and compel him finally to reduce the price of labor nominally as well until the total price of the increased number of hours goes down, and therefore the daily or weekly wage falls. Let's see here. So we should read this paragraph. Can I read this paragraph?
Yeah, go ahead.
That was the last note, actually. I thought it was the last one, but
I was actually gonna mention that the very next sentence after the paragraph that I was reading says legal limitation of the working day puts an end to this pastime. So yeah, it was pretty funny. That's exactly what we're talking about. Can I also read the footnote before you go on?
Yeah, sure. Read the footnote,
yeah. Okay, so he says, for instance, if a factory worker refuses to work the long hours which are customary, he would shortly be replaced by somebody who would work any length of time and thus be thrown out of employment. If one man performs the work of two, the rate of profits will generally be raised in consequence of the additional supply of labor having diminished its price.
Yeah.
So yeah, that leads up to where you're going to read, I think.
Okay. The determination of the price of labor by use of the ratio daily value of labor power shows that a mere pro-working... the use of the ratio daily value of labor power over working day of a given number of hours shows that a mere prolongation of the working day lowers the price of labor, if no compensatory factor enters. But the same circumstances which allow the capitalist in the long run to prolong the working day also allow him at first and compel him finally to reduce the price of labor nominally as well until the total price of the increased number of hours goes down, and therefore the daily or weekly wage falls. So I guess, I don't know, I think here what it's talking about is the relationship between socially necessary labor time and these kind of tendencies that can emerge. If one man does the work of one half a man or two men, the supply of labor increases, although the supply of labor power in the market remains constant. The competition thus created between the workers allows the capitalist to force down the price of labor, while the fall in the price of labor allows him, on the other hand, to force up the hours of work still further. Okay, this is really interesting, right? So, if you have half of workers unemployed and half working twice as many hours, that creates competition that causes the the price of labor to actually fall, right? Again, keep in mind, price of labor here is not, the value of labor power, right? Soon, however, this command over abnormal quantities of unpaid labor, i.e. quantities in excess of the average social amount, becomes a source of competition amongst the capitalists themselves. A part of the price of the commodity consists of the price of labor. The unpaid part of the price of labor does not need to be reckoned as part of the price of the commodity. It may be given to the buyer as a present. This is the first step taken under the impulse of competition. Okay, yeah, so he's talking about competition here. So a part of the price of the commodity consists of the price of labor. Wait. Soon, however, this command over abnormal quantities of unpaid labor, i.e. quantities in excess of the average social amount, becomes a source of competition amongst the capitalists themselves. So they're going to be racing, right, to raise, right, he's talking about absolute surplus value here, to get people to work more beyond the normal working week, right? A part of the price of the commodity consists of the price of labor. The unpaid part of the price of labor does not need to be reckoned as part of the price of the commodity. It may be given to the buyer as a present. So if you're able to extract a lot of absolute surplus value, then you can actually, in other words, gift part of that to the buyer, right, in the form of a discount on the goods for the purposes of competition. So that's like price cutting, right? The second step, also compelled by competition, is the exclusion from the selling price of the commodity of at least a part of the abnormal surplus value created by the extension of the working day. In this way, an abnormally low selling price of the commodity rises at first sporadically and becomes fixed by degrees. The slower selling price henceforward becomes the constant basis of a miserable wage for excessive hours of work. So again, renormalization of socially necessary labor time, just as originally it was in the product of those very circumstances. The movement is simply indicated here as the analysis of competition does not belong to this part of the investigation. Nevertheless, let the capitalist speak for himself for a moment. In Birmingham, there is so much competition of masters one against another that many are obliged to do things as employers they would otherwise be ashamed of, and yet no more money is made, but only the public gets the benefit. The reader will remember the two sources by which
that is from the Children's Employment Commission, by the way.
by which they mean the consumer, right? Not the public.
Yeah.
The full price denounced their rivals before the Parliamentary Committee of Inquiry. They only exist now by first defrauding the public and next getting 18 hours of work out of their men for 12 hours wages. The unpaid labor of the men was made. The source whereby the competition was carried on and continues so to this day. The competition among the master bakers is the cause of the difficulty in getting rid of night work. An underseller who sells his bread below the cost price according to the price of flour must make it up by getting more to the labor of the men. If I get only 12 hours of work out of my men, and my neighbor got 18 or 20, he must beat me in the selling price. If the men could insist on payment for overwork, this would be set right. A large number of those employed by the undersellers are foreigners and youths who are obliged to accept almost any wages they can obtain. Okay, so I think that's the last major theoretical point. So why do they organize this? Why pay some people big amounts? Well, they don't pay some people big amounts. Like the idea is that when you have the situation where there's a large surplus labor force, and therefore you can demand more hours of labor beyond the normal working week, working day, from the laborers, what this allows you to do is to artificially lower the value of the commodity, right? And for the purposes of competition. So there's a competition that emerges amongst capitalists who are able to marshal, working time, right, in excess of the socially normal amount, and then they're able to cut prices. And actually, you see price cutting as being a pretty, fixed feature of competition, right? So, like for example, like with game consoles, it's well known that one thing that really helps, like Sony and Microsoft, is that they're able to actually sell, in many cases, like they'll sell like a PlayStation or an Xbox for less than the cost of its production. And the logic of that, is one, let's say, in the immediate duration of a console lifespan, that it will be possible to capitalize on a lot of other goods and services that people will buy, like games, Xbox Live membership, and so on. And the other part of the logic is that it's a necessary loss leader to put forth in order to engage or to acquire permanent control of the industry, right? At which point you could actually just set monopoly prices, right?
Yeah.
So again, it's they are trying to sell time to the worker, which makes them want to work to buy time. Well, they're trying to sell time to the worker.
We were talking. That's when we were talking about The Sims, about how better jobs get less hours of work.
how is it artificial? What do you mean, Danielle Jacobs? Can you elaborate on that? What did I say was artificial? Cutting prices in the sense is like pruning to grow more. Yes, that's the idea, right? Because like you're able to like acquire control of like a market, right? Now, again, Marx is describing it vis-a-vis labor here. I was giving a more general example of how it functions in competition. You'd have to tease out the relationship to labor, which is going to be a lot more complex. Like if you take any modern example, yeah, this is the idea. It's that by cutting the price, you're able to sell more than the other people who are also controlling, labor in excess of the working day, right? Okay, there we go. So any thoughts on that? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I wanted to bring up another footnote, if I'm allowed to do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ernesto, you're definitely allowed to bring up the
Thank you.
footnotes.
Okay. So there's a great sentence that says the increase in the price of labor, page 687. The increase in the price of labor when the working day is extended beyond a certain normal limit takes place in various British industries in such a way that the low price of labor during the so-called normal time compels the worker to work during the better paid overtime if he wishes to obtain a sufficient wage at all. Right? So we talked about this a little bit, but I wanted to point out examples in the footnotes because I thought they were pretty interesting. It says, as for instance, in the bleaching works of Scotland, in some part of Scotland, this trade, before the introduction of the Factory Act in 1862, was carried on by a system of overtime, i.e. 10 hours a day were the regular hours of work, for which a nominal wage of 1 shilling and 2 pence per day was paid to a man, there being every day overtime for 3 or 4 hours, paid at the rate of 3 pence per hour. The effect of the system was as follows. A man could not earn more than 8 shillings per week when working the ordinary hours. Without overtime, they could not earn a fair day's wages. The higher wages for getting adult males to work longer hours are a temptation too strong to be resisted. The bookbinding, this is also a very interesting detail. The bookbinding trade in the city of London employs a large number of young girls from 14 to 15 years old under indentures which prescribe certain definite hours of labor. Nevertheless, they work in the last week of each month until 10, 11, 12, or 1 o'clock at night, along with the older male workers in very mixed company. The masters tempt them by extra pay and supper, which they eat in neighboring public houses. The great debauchery thus produced among these young immorals, Children's Employment Commission, finds its compensation in the fact that, among other things, they bind many Bibles and other edifying books.
Okay, a little bit of sarcasm there.
So that's well, it's so funny that to see the institution of the Children's Employment Commission in terms of like it's this sort of idea of the necessity of paying wage laborers who, one, shouldn't be wage laborers, and two, also the wage that they are paid is exploited, then gets the institutional posit, which is the problem with capitalistic thinking and the necessity of dialectical critique, which is, but we already have a solution for this. It's the Children's Employment Commission, so nothing happens, right? Yeah, and the public what are they doing while they work alongside grown men? Why they're binding Bibles, of course, right? So ridiculous.
Yeah, and I love those like kind of little allusions in Marx's work where he's like these young ladies in the ravenous clutches of the the tramp workers. He's like, okay.
Jesus.
Well, there's a I was gonna say though, just to say quickly, like I know like I made a video for Zero that wasn't deigned to be like professional enough to really get run ages ago, but part of it was excerpted. The context was altered quite a bit, but in the video Her Sexuality Against Philosophy, where they talked about my views and those of Victoria Brooks. But yeah, I mean, what I talk about is the change in Marx's view of women. So like initially they're sort of like, oh, like women are weaker and like, that's inherent. And, communism should be a society which protects its most vulnerable members. Whereas later when they get into like the anthropology of Lewis Henry Morgan, they're like, oh, wait, like, the notion of male superiority is itself like a specific historical construct that therefore, can be, so they begin to question the nature of those assumptions, right?
Well,
so you see these
Marx already overcomes in a difference. he doesn't actualize it in that particular tendency, but he's already overcoming the idea of nature as it becomes labor, the sort of humanizing of nature. So to revert back to nature as a principle and an end point of any sort of human relation kind of doesn't fit his earlier or his statement in I think it's like chapter 9 in Capital, which is that sort of like we talked about before that. Not chapter 9, it's like chapter 11 and 12. The metaphysical sort of dialectical idea of labor is the force which changes nature into something human. So I think it makes sense that he corrected that sort of Jordan Peterson-esque lobster. Lobster. Which you see expounded on, of course it's expounded on by the right, which is, we need to protect the women, especially in Europe. Maybe not so much you don't really hear that narrative as much in the United States, but you certainly hear it in the UK, right? Or if you read like UK right-wing publications, the protect the women is, from the Middle Easterners, is very much like front and center in right-wing discourse.
Oh yeah, and that's really ubiquitous. Like if you go to Ukraine, for example, there's a lot of students who come from the Middle East, like Turks and North Africans and stuff like that. And I found like when I was in Kharkiv, like it's quite racist compared to, openly anyway, compared to like the West. Because we have to, I mean, that's like psychological racism. It's not so much perpetuated just at the structural level. Like I had a friend who was an African student there, and like people would shout monkey at her and stuff when she went in the metro.
In Ukraine.
In East Ukraine, yeah.
That's wild.
But this is like this is the thing about that is like it's often framed in terms of the need to like protect their society from like the insidious conservative influences that are being introduced by Middle Easterners. So I think it kind of makes sense.
But that's an obfuscation because they themselves are like fascistic. So it's like they're it's not right-wing authoritarian,
right?
Neo-Nazism versus theocratic. It's both right-wing kind of structures, but the idea that the right-wing structure of like you could say Islamo-monarchism is present because somebody's on your subway is typical of the right-wing neo-fascist mystification of what is sort of actually happening.
Yeah. Well, it's like a cultural mystification. At the same time, I'd just be a bit like careful about those are fascist aspects. I'd be a bit careful about applying the label fascist straightforward.
Yeah, I know. That's why I said neo-fascist.
Okay, yeah. But I mean, because the
that's how I get around the Zizek. Oh, I hate the fascists. How you hate neo-fascist?
If you talk to, there is an authoritarian impulse. But if you go to Eastern Ukraine, they're between. So in Western Ukraine, you have the Maidan Orange Revolution, which is an odd thing because you have a mix there. You have a lot of people, and maybe the predominant element who just want to be, more liberal society in the EU and so on. And then you've got a very, very palpable nationalist side. Sorry?
That's what I'm talking about is the nationalist side of, the Ukraine. But yeah, it's important not to obfuscate conservative capitalists with, fascists, because then it obfuscates capitalism as a problem in general and returns some sort of narrative of like, oh, it's the racist versus the non-racist and work gets lost once again. And exploitation gets lost once again. Here's the
thing about East Ukraine. So I'm talking about Kharkiv, which is in the east. So in the west, they were very aligned with like Maidan, but in the east, their native language is Russian. Now we know some parts of the east, like Crimea, of course, was invaded by Russia and incorporated into it. And they had a referendum, and I talked to a guy from Germany who worked on the referendum verification, which you shouldn't invade a sovereign state generally. But he did say within that context that it was true that most people in Crimea voted to join Russia. Now in Eastern Ukraine, it's interesting if you go to like Kharkiv, because my sense of people is like, they like if you talk to people, they're actually I kind of like it because if you talk to people that not the egregious racism, but if you talk to people, they're like, we don't want to be part of Russia because that seems like it would suck. They're like, but at the same time, like if you look in the West, they'll like. Haul up pictures of like Stephen Bandera, like Ukrainian nationalist Nazi collaborators, and we're not really down with that either. So I mean, yeah, for all of their like all this atrocious stuff, they do, compared to I said in this dispute, they have a more moderate maybe position, right? Because of their the fact of being Ukrainian but being Russian, right? It's like
but the idea that Russian imperialism is validated by the democratic, I guess, simple majority equals, oh, then we can come and we can restructure your country. You know what it reminds me of is, I forget his name, which I'm embarrassed of, but the guy who played Magnus Carlsen in the chess world championships a couple years ago.
Oh yeah, the Russian nationalist who he was like.
Well, he wasn't just. I have some inside information actually from a W women's grandmaster here in Glendale, California, which is that not only was he once Crimea was invaded, he was then given a sort of vacation home temporarily in Crimea for him to enjoy, because he's the Russian chess master. So now they get to use these resources in Crimea. So that's a little inside factoid, and he's very kind of hated for it. This guy.
Is this Sergei Karjasin? Is that
I believe so. I don't know.
Is he the guy who, I don't know if it was him, is he the guy who one of them I heard when he was asked what he thought of gay marriage being legalized in the States, he spat on the ground and he said I'm so appalled by this that it makes me happy that I never have set foot and never will set foot in the United States of America.
I don't know. I don't know if that's him. I think his name was Sergei. Why do I want to say it? I want to say Karpov, but I don't think it was Karpov. Am I hallucinating? Yeah, that's a different.
No, Karpov. No, Karpov was
a different guy.
Karpov was pro-communist. And actually, my dad.
Yeah.
My dad, and my dad knew Karpov and Kasparov because he was a pro chess player, and he actually had a hilarious conversation with Karpov. So Kasparov was anti-communist from Azerbaijan, I think, right? Was it Azerbaijan? For Kasparov, I forget exactly what, and Karpov was pro-Soviet, and this was in the time of glasnost and perestroika, in the 80s with Gorbachev, and liberalization of the Soviet Union. And my dad was in the car with Karpov, and he goes,
Sergei Karjakin.
Okay. Karjakin, okay. My dad was in the car with Karpov, and Karpov had this long-running rivalry with Kasparov. Karpov, pro-communist, Kasparov, anti-communist. And Karpov, he said, Hamilton, he goes, do you think that glasnost is scientific experiment or political experiment? And my dad, he goes, well, I think it's a political experiment, of course. And then alluding to Kasparov, he says, but then why do they try it on the rats first?
That's a funny little story.
Yeah. But yeah, that's probably going to be on chess.com tomorrow, right? I'm sure if I did divulge this stuff, but
no, there's such a deep I think inside IMGM, NM, FM lore. I don't think they're in a hurry to publish it all. It's very quirky. It's a very quirky world.
Can I think we should get on this because we really should try to get at this question. Is labor a natural force? Well, okay, I'm just gonna start with how we go through it in Marx. So you have a distinction here between labor power and labor, right? And surplus labor, right? So labor power, according to Marx, is the innate capacity to labor. Whereas labor itself is what's paid for labor, which is the classical political economy definition. And then you have surplus labor, right? Which is labor that's performed in excess of the amount that's necessary to reproduce labor. And that's expressed as surplus value within the capitalist formulation. You can also put it other ways. You can say social surplus product, for example, if you want to refer more to, an implication of physical goods, right? Then you have concrete labor and abstract labor. Now, concrete labor refers to the production of use values, right? Whereas abstract labor refers to the production of use values in such a way where labor time is valuated, right? Or it's creating exchange values as well. There's a simultaneous creation of exchange values. So, well, simplistically, you could say concrete labor, use value, abstract labor, exchange value. Now, again, this question of is it natural? It's well,
yeah, we see it. We see the YouTube.
Okay, so she's saying so labor power is nature, and Underwigan is saying no. Okay, yeah, but Marx does say that it's an inherent capacity, right? But the thing is let's see here. This is again, this is quite this is complicated. So if we look. Um,
Can I say something quickly?
Yeah.
So there's back and forth on our YouTube discussion here, which is we have the artist and then the Marxist going back and forth. Kirsty going, labor is such a birthing metaphor, you labor, and Marxist goes, what? Labor. And then Kirsty's, everything is nature though, nature versus nature.
Okay, so this
I think is a proper thing to sort of challenge, because if everything is nature, then we don't get the proper noun of what is human and what does labor do. I think there is something correct in the Freudian sense of, labor, the toil involved in labor, the substantial quality of work labor, as well as the substantial difficulty of birthing is there. But so, which kind of leads to this, which is, but when you are trying to find specific tendencies, that's why I think philosophers work so hard to define new terms or create proper terms, so that, because words have lack, as we know from Lacan, so they're trying to encapsulate a certain idea.
Actually, yeah, Kirsty's putting forth some good questions here. I think there's a bit of confusion between labor and labor power, right? Which is why probably Daniel says what, because labor, of course, is for Marx. This is referring to the value of labor as in classical political economy, but he does use it a bit differently. But this is the sense it's used in this chapter. But again, so to give you Postone, so Postone is probably maybe one of the most famous exponents of this idea that the centrality of labor and its importance is something that's generated because of the capitalist, the commodity form of social relations, he calls it. So in other words, it's the character of capitalist production, not just exchange, that engenders the metaphysical significance of the category of labor, right? So then so Marx describes abstract labor as literally, in Capital, he describes it as involving just the abstraction of labor, right? The abstraction inherent that could be inherent to collective labor, even outside, say the capitalist mode of production, for example. And Postone is this is highly problematic, that Marx referred to, this kind of thing. But again, it's actually interesting because it's kind of a pseudo problem in a way, because Marx basically says that the question of abstract labor acquires its significance in relation to its organization. So while you could have the collective performance of labor at a tribal level that's abstracted, it just doesn't have anything like the same importance that it's going to have under capitalism, right? So that's kind of, and it's a bit more let me pull out the definition of abstract. I want to elaborate on this a bit because there's a relationship to exchange value too. So I want to pull this out a little bit. I'm going to be criticized. Here we go. So, all labor is the expenditure of human labor. All labor is the expenditure of human labor power in a special form and with a definite aim. And in this, its character of concrete, useful labor, it produces use values. Okay, wait. So from my thesis, I'm just going to pull this thing that Postone has on this problematic formulation. Wait. Okay. Yes. This is. Let's see. Okay. In the physiological sense of being equal. Okay. So let me pull this story. Let me grab this out from Capital. This is really important that we talk about this. Okay. I got so many books called Capital in my. Okay, here we go. Physiological.
Should I do a drum intervent
okay
while you're looking?
Here we go. On the one hand, all labor, this is what Marx writes early on in Capital. On the one hand, all labor is an expenditure of human labor power in the physiological sense, and is in this quality of being equal or abstract human labor that it forms the value of commodities. On the other hand, all labor is an expenditure of human labor power in a particular form with a definite aim. And it is in this quality of being concrete, useful labor that it produces use values. Okay, so all labor is an expenditure of human labor power in the physiological sense. And it is in this quality of being equal abstract. Okay, so yeah, what he's saying is that I would interpret this as basically saying that if you look at the way that, and Postone doesn't really understand this, but if you look at the way that absolute surplus value or relative surplus value are produced, they do so by reducing, right, labor to a common element, right? So it's like, and the extreme of this is relative surplus value, where if everyone's using machines, there has to be like a universal aspect of labor that those machines index to, right?
Yeah.
So he's saying all labor can potentially, like, there's a certain pre-existing similarity in all labor power, right? But that it becomes abstracted, right, in the process of value creation.
What is that similarity, Conrad, if you could make it clear?
Well, just in the sense that everyone can labor.
Everyone can labor.
Yeah,
well,
everyone can labor. So that's a similarity, right? Like that's an abstract.
That's not true. Not everyone can.
Yeah.
Well, whatever that means, right? Like whatever that means, right? If you could hit a button, okay. Like
no, really. Like that's why we shouldn't go past that. It's like
no, but I'm not. He's not. The problem is he's not talking about capitalist labor at that stage. He's talking about like potentially any form of labor, right? So that's so general that of course it could be extended to everything, right? But the question is, how is it like? So when you have absolute surplus value, then people are pushed to their limits, right? And that exposes, in a way, right, the character of labor power by pushing it to its limit, right?
So
because we find there are certain common characteristics.
Yeah, how does it push people to their limits?
Well, lengthening the working day.
Yeah,
right. So that makes the biological character of labor, on average, let's say, appear, right? But the problem is it appears in a differentiated way, because like women and men can do different quantities of labor, right? But then in relative surplus value, if you're just hitting a button, for example, right? Then it's like totally abstracted, where it's like it becomes like a human trait, right? Like in that way. And this is, because of value production, right? So again, you see labor becoming a totally abstract thing, right? Like when you have the total organization of labor by machines, right? But then we have Turing machines, and that's a bit more complicated. Okay, right? But I'm talking about the sort of industrial.
How is it more complicated? How is a Turing machine more?
Well, because if you have more complicated input structures, then there's other questions like about cognitive ability and stuff like that. Right. But if you use these sort of examples that Marx is talking about factory machines, right. And again, labor becomes highly abstracted in this process because it's like stuff like it has to be, these machines have to be made for universal, so they can be used relatively universally. Right.
Yeah.
Does that like, so this is my way of unpacking that. Postone just
I'm only asking because when you say something I don't understand, as brother Riza Islam says, as he suggested, don't skip over it.
They say that in Scientology too.
I know. that is the beginning of Dianetics as well, which I found out after going through this. Well, it's interesting because there's a whole Nation of Islam passage through science and then excursion out of Scientology to a certain extent as well. Kind of funny. Nation of Islam history. Anyway,
Scientology is actually fascinating because I like this, Kirsty Woods. Concepts are similar to machines in that sense. Yes, this is actually true. And again, this is the argument of this would be the argument of my thesis, that it's like the distinction between use value and exchange value, which is connected to production, right, and exchange, that actually grounds the distinction between the abstract notions of form. So you have to have value as an abstract form before Thales can say everything's water, right? So then even the question of the compossibility of language and being in that basis would emerge from value as a form, right? And Parmenides, I think, says that. He is maybe the first one to pose the question.
Are we going to talk about why Scientology is interesting? I think it's interesting because it does something which I was trying to do, which is trying to dirempt survival. And I haven't gone through the whole book, but it's interesting, their description of the basis of life. It's very singular, and the problem with it and why you get the end result is this sort of vicious institution. It sort of brings everything down to social status, sex. I forget the other two, but it seemed like it wasn't that much clear from social status and sex.
It's very influenced by Jung and psychoanalysis, right? Because e-meters were developed by Jung, right?
I remember e-meter. No, I don't. Were they?
Yeah, e-meters were developed by Jung.
I'm glad that's true. If it is true,
it's true. This is Scientology.
More fire against Jung. More fire to use against Jung. I wouldn't be surprised.
Oh, but how? They believe in past lives and all this you're recalling.
Yeah, but I almost think that's sort of that takes away from the psychology of Scientology, which is the survivalism, and the sort of the quote unquote acceptance of the basis of life as these sort of competitive interactions, right? And that's why you get the very in-your-face Scientologist.
Well, I think Scientology for me is a branch of Jungianism. So Bob Thomas.
Jungianism?
I like it. Go on.
Here's a quote from Wikipedia. Bob Thomas, senior executive of the Church of Scientology in the United States, described the e-meter. Some very early work done on this was done by Jung, who used a list of words. I think he combined it with the psychogalvanometer.
No, I think he's talking about Jung when he was a Freudian, had a list of free associative words, and so I think it's extraordinarily out of context.
No,
also,
but he said here,
Jung himself. Keep in mind, Jung himself says, "Thank God I am Jung and not a Jungian." So it's not like he's the same as these.
Oh yeah, okay. But like here, look, I think he combined it with the psychogalvanometer. By this word association, he was attempting to increase the effectiveness of the free association techniques, which he was not sure about. So he used something called the psychogalvanometer in relation to words. And like I think maybe in Scientology they do these word associations as well.
But it's really Freud. That was when Jung was a proper Freudian, when he was still following.
But did Freud use like the psychogalvanometer?
Did Jung use a psychogalvanometer? I would put that radically into question. I think he did some measurement. Instrument for testing mental reaction by determining skin resistance. I don't know if he did. I think it's possible.
Well, look here. I looked it up again. It's
certainly in a dangerous method. I don't know if he really did that.
This is from a virtual exhibition on David Cronenberg.
Yeah.
Used by Carl Jung as a scientific gauge for the complex physiological responses of the body to emotional stimuli, the psychogalvanometer measures changes in skin resistance related to emotional stress. So, like it's
another way to say that there's already a problem there, because it's measuring something and then it's attributing it to a singular cause. So it's bullshit.
But it does seem that he did this.
When I personally did the e-meter test, I remember they're like, okay, think words, just keep thinking. And I just went, okay, I'm going to focus. I'm going to go poop, 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 poop. And they go, what do you think about there? I said poop. What do you think about it? They're like, no, you weren't. I was like, yes, I was. I was thinking poop, poop. Same word over and over and over and over and over. Of course, Hegel could argue, it's like, but the repetition. The seventh poop wasn't the first poop, right?
Yeah.
But no, it's bullshit pseudoscience.
Sure. But I'm saying, do you think it's possible that Jung, because I've found several sources saying he used a psychogalvanometer.
I'm sure. He also wrote about flying saucers. That's why I'm not.
Yeah, why not?
But it doesn't mean that he wasn't using the free associative technique, which is the Freudian technique, which is the core of the pause of how quickly they answer. So if there is a long pause, you ask them more. And I've used that in practice, and you do get a lot out of that. Although free association, I don't feel is super necessary, because if you say, tell me what's on your mind and don't censor yourself, try not to censor yourself. You get free association anyway. You don't really need to put them into your list of words. And then
there is this Jungian
naturally.
But there is this Jungian aspect with like the past lives and all this, right?
Sure, but past lives isn't Jungian. Past lives is, Hinduism. It's just something Jung also recaptured, and these other people recaptured.
Okay, but like I feel like this sort of, not just Jung. There's definitely a psychoanalytic influence, and like it's clear that Scientology was formulated when psychoanalysis was very popular, because there's a certain credibility.
Yeah, well, after Freud's death, there became this sort of. It wasn't even before. Let me see. When did Scientology? I think it was definitely after, because it was in that sci-fi writers competition. So yeah, after Freud's death, there's this explosion of different schools of psychology. And
the 50s,
yeah. So, and it was popularized as well in a way we don't see today, in terms of like proper psychologists and psychoanalysts sort of going against each other. You have the Gloria tapes, which are interesting, like just a small example of the multiplicity of a singular time. You have like cognitive therapy, you have Gestalt therapy, you have humanistic therapy, and that's not even counting the Jungians, of course, which were all sort of going forth and expanding, and then the sort of dying down of that sort of geist of the scientizing of the practice of clinical psychology, to the point where now everybody's sort of satisfied with you could say I would say the life coaching narrative is like the most popular form, or the myth, or something like that. But that's why I think there is a sort of market for a return to a scientific psychoanalysis and psychology, and in terms of why anybody listens to me whatsoever is because, basically popularizing a return to clinical psychology as the science which produces human happiness in a negative sort of sense, and in terms of you don't posit necessarily a solution, but rather you work through what is tangled and undo neurosis and reduce psychological distress, essentially. Right.
Yeah,
so
I find it great. So are you implying that part of the reason that Scientology has some appeal is because of like the prevalence of CBT and stuff like this today? Like that there's some kind of longing for more like psychoanalytically derived approaches, even if it's not.
I think Scientology is popular because it has an interesting little cocktail you can take, which is the survival mode, the multiplicity of differences. Let me look it up really quick.
So be our next work. Freaking L. Ron Hubbard. We did get Jordan Peterson.
We can go through
Ayn Rand and L. Ron Hubbard.
Right at the beginning. I didn't read much of Dianetics, but let's see. The goal of life, survival, pain, disappointment, failure. Anyway, there's a multiplicity of different survival, but it's sex and social status and power essentially is sort of like these are the sort of these are not positive things, but they're survival mode in terms of to go clear is to know that this is the basis of all of humanity. But the problem is ideas break away from their initial survival thing, and then you can discuss ideas themselves. So it's too simplistic, and it doesn't even get to the Freudian point of sublimating into the world. It just goes. It always refers to the deeper metaphysical substrate of the idea of this basic survival.
Which does sound like Peterson.
Yeah, that is similar to Peterson. Maybe that's why Peterson is successful. If you can break people down and say it's like the initial natural survival mechanism, of course, and you ignore the. You can even say Freud as well. Back to sex and death drive. I think his is more interesting, but I think it has that in terms of what gives it that cult-like power is like we're going to break down society and show you that it's really about this burn core, and I think the Freudian burn core is really there's a sort of primacy to the Freudian burn core, and then he does more than that, and he goes into, and what I'm writing in the book, the ego in its hyperstate, is the Freudian molecule, which is how fantasy condenses, and we get these sort of items, and then so Freud maps that out, which L. Ron Hubbard doesn't do anything like that. But yeah,
well, I mean, but Lacan is the one who really denaturalizes a lot of what Freud's doing, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'm trying to recall the specific vocabulary because like Adrian Johnston talks about this a great deal. But the way that, because I wrote this a while ago, but I'm trying to remember, it's the way that like, it has to do with the category of like the specific injunction against phylogenetic explanations that Lacan employs in his work.
What do you mean by phylogenetic?
Let me just pull it up here.
Because that's a big word, Conrad. Can you explain?
I don't remember what I think, so I have to read my thesis to tell me what I think. What do I think, thesis?
Phylogenetic.
Okay, so while Freud distinguished between the ontogenetic and the phylogenetic, Lacan, by rejecting phylogeny, not only stays within the contours of what Adrian Johnston calls sacred history based solely upon sociolinguistic remains, but he also contradicts his own stress on the way that, quote, non-linguistic contents can count as signifiers, as well as fails to do justice to the capacity of, quote, post-Darwinian evolutionary theory. So that's a summary of Johnston. Let's see. So you can see here, he like Johnston, he doesn't reject Lacan, but he critiques Lacan for adopting a model that's like too anthropocentric, and he tries to positively assess some of Freud's naturalizing aspects.
Yeah, and I would agree with that absolutely in terms of eventually, if you're trying to describe the primal content of the unconscious, to simply make it into something that's after, you could say, the labor of language goes into it. To a certain extent, there is something there. That is the sort of primordial thing.
Well, yeah, and for Johnston, the big provocation is speculative realism, right? Because he's trying to rethink like Lacanian, Zizekian psychoanalysis in relation to the developments of speculative realism. So his big sort of thing is like, and again, this has to do with, we were talking before about like the unary trait and like non-linguistic contents in psychoanalysis. And his big thing is like, I mean, in a way, it's like it's a natural ontologization of the negativity, right? That's inherent within Lacan's system or within psychoanalysis. So what he argues ultimately is that negativity is like an inherent feature of nature, right? And I think there were like Milner and people like this. There was like some work on this, but it's this like ontologization of Lacan, right? And then he wants to try to use this view of ontological negativity. So he takes Stephen Jay Gould's work on evolution, and like Gould stresses like contingency. So he wants to argue there's like a negative or contingent aspect to nature that is not represented by.
What do you mean by contingency, Conrad?
Well, okay, so Lacan has a critique of Lacan has a critique of science, right? What does he say?
But what is contingency? You're explaining this?
Yeah, I'm just like, one second. Let me just dig through this a bit. So, contingency in the context of evolution for Jay Gould is the idea that there's not like a purely deterministic pattern that based on like survival of the fittest or whatever, right? Like these kind of that like there are aleatory combinations within
which makes a lot of sense due to the, you could say, irrational nature of certain things. And I mean, the idea that survival of the fittest is what determines, fittest is really a questionable concept because a lot of preferable traits is a sort of better concept, maybe. But even that is like subject to randomness.
So Lacan has a critique of science, right, and the way it functions, right? And he basically says like it has a tendency to try to portray everything like it's indebted to like a certain kind of religious teleology, right? In which science tries to present everything based on a kind of like teleological mechanical causality, right?
Yeah. You're gonna love my book, Conrad. It's gonna be so good.
I'm looking forward to it. I'll be reviewing an advanced copy of Eliot's new book. What's the title, Eliot?
The Ego in its Hyperstate, the definitive guide to rational self-interest. And it starts out, it's basically the idea is that self-interest is the ground of all existence. And then it starts with a Freudian read, and it goes from there.
I'm sure I have a lot to say about that as a Marxist. But I do appreciate like Stirner and these kind of things too. So it'd be interesting. But I just want to say about this, like, so Lacan has this critique of kind of this sort of scientific teleology. And so what Johnston's trying to argue is that like our scientific methods can't represent the role of negativity or contingency in natural processes. So what he argues is that we have to turn, he combines like Lacanian psychoanalysis, Zizekian Lacanian psychoanalysis with like dialectics of nature. And he's like, oh, Hegel knows, like we have to revive the philosophy of nature, right? Because Hegel knows there's like a negativity and contingency in natural developments. So again, he uses the content, this Hegelianized Lacano-Zizekian psychoanalysis to try to provide a framing philosophy of nature. That's in A Weak Nature alone, principally, but there's a trilogy of books, Prolegomena and Any Future Metaphysic. You should read those, by the way, Eliot. You should.
Don't tell me to read a book, Conrad.
Okay, I just meant I'd be interested to hear your opinion.
Okay, yeah, send it to
me. Someone likes when I say haggle.
Haggle.
Yeah.
Pass the bag.
But there's a lot more on that in my thesis. I just don't have like it's not like with Marx. Like my Lacanian stuff is not like right at hand in the same way. So I have to. It ends up being a little bit messy when I try to summarize it, right? Especially when I'm a bit distant from having written it. So. Hegel is a Conradian quirk. Okay. Yeah. Well, what am I supposed to say? Because everybody says it like differently.
Well, Canadians they say A's differently, like pasta versus pasta. Hegel versus Hagel.
But why an A?
That's just the Canadian. That's a Canadian accent.
Okay.
Well, what am I supposed to say? Like it's like because you go to France and they're like Hegel.
Hegel.
Hegel, il est un de le plus important philosophe de l'histoire.
I'm always saying French shit like that.
Hegel. But if you go to Germany, they're different. They're like Hegel or something like it's like Hegel. Hegel. Like it's like different.
Hegel,
So,
okay.
Hegel. Yeah, it's different. So what I mean is like every country has its own.
Yeah,
different way. So why the fuck would anyone criticize like as long as it like approximates the words?
Yeah.
It's just ridiculous to me.
We know who we're talking about. Yeah.
American chauvinism.
It's like it's like people who say like it's like people who get mad when you say Sartre. It's like shut the fuck up. Like who cares? Like just like if you know who someone's talking about, you shouldn't complain. Like when I say Sartre, right? Well, that's not how it's written in English. Like I'm sorry, that doesn't like.
Yeah. In Spanish, we call Hegel, we call him Hegel, and Sartre, we call him Sartre, right? Because like you said, we need to know who we're talking about.
Sartre.
I feel also like, because in Spanish you actually pronounce letters.
In Latin America because Sartre.
That
has a nice click to it, doesn't it?
I know. Yeah.
I need articles on how everything was better in Latin America, like why anime was different and better in Latin America. I want like why Sartre was better and different in Latin America.
Yeah, we need all of that content. Yeah.
Just every week, I want a new article on superior concepts of Latin America.
Yeah. Well, in Latin America, we really embraced clinical psychology, and there's a lot of schools of Gestalt therapy, of psychoanalysis, of critical theory. So that's better in Latin America.
Wait,
yeah.
Sorry, continue.
Definitely. I mean, like the idea that in terms like clinical psychology is much more expanded upon because there's not that imposition from, you could say, the American tendency to sterilize and empiricize things, including subjects which that very process, it sort of degrades the subject.
Oh yeah, we don't have advertisements for pharmaceuticals like you guys do to begin with.
Yeah.
Yeah. Liberation theology only works in Latin America, really.
Why is that?
Because it's much more Catholic than Christian, I would say.
Yeah.
Well, there's just no need to. Like it would just be like the European left has a long secular history. Right. So like when you're trying to broaden the appeal of socialism to like the rural populations and stuff in Latin America, which are disproportionate compared to the most developed countries, it's like, it can be very helpful to find it. You see the same thing with like Algeria with right, like the National Liberation Front. Like it was kind of like a blend of Marxism with certain like Islamic aspects. So it's not uncommon in the Middle East, right, where you see those sort of fusion of religion and socialism as well.
Yeah.
So should Murphy start his patch in Latin America then, because they're already
you know what is definitely better in Latin America?
It doesn't make any sense.
Autonomous zones.
What?
Okay.
Autonomous zones are much better in Latin America.
What are? Say that.
Autonomous zones like jazz.
Oh, jazz.
Oh, yeah. Well, wherever the governments were probably.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, the government's way worse in Latin America. That's also
the world's best autonomous zone is Hong Kong, of course, as we know.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah. Now they're fighting to keep their autonomous zone, right?
It'll be interesting going through the works like you suggested of Xi, Deng, and Mao, because even though I critique China heavily, it's not the idea, which is not to eliminate socialism off the face of the earth. It's more to sort of draw out these sort of contradictions for, you could say, educational purposes.
Yeah.
Well, it's also actually important to look at the details because, like, it's especially true of first world Marxists. Like, I was at a discussion the other day, and like my friend, she wanted to inject a bit of anarchy into the discussion. So all these like left comms, kind of anarcho-communists there, and she was like, "Oh, Conrad likes China," and then like everybody just got like extremely harassable, and and like I was saying like I think their project of building a republic and resisting like egregious forms of colonialism and the way they use capital controls and infrastructure and blah blah. I basically said I think the general historical trajectory is good. I'm not saying there aren't abuses or problems, which I think is fair. Yeah. But like it was just funny.
There's a problem in the left because where's the nuance, right? Won't somebody think of the nuance?
Yeah. That's our. Got any more of that nuance?
Well, because I was talking with I forget. I think it was. I forget I forget which online leftist. It might not. I don't think it was Cosmonaut. It was somebody else.
Was it Non-Compete?
No, not non.
You had a conversation.
Twitter. I had a stupid Twitter back and forth with him. Yeah. No, but there was a discussion about China, and the people who do defend China feel the need to do propaganda for China, to like just repeat the Chinese Communist Party line And then, the leftcom tendency is to like, oh, China, oh, you mean, they're simply evil. I think there is a sort of, but the problem is if you want to analyze China, I feel like my position is going to always be the one of critique, because that's sort of where I'm more drawn towards. I don't feel the need to do propaganda for the Chinese Communist Party, although I do. I feel like Conrad, we can be a machine. Conrad, you can be that aspect of it. We'll go back and forth.
Well, my position is critique within, because like there are certain political structures I think that deserve to be fundamentally supported.
Yeah.
Right. My position is critique within the context of fundamental support for the project of the PRC in very general terms. Right. It's like, I would feel the same way if we were talking about Italy. Right. Like I'm not going to repudiate the basis of the Italian Republic. Right. Now I can criticize actions of the government or whatever. Right. But Machiavelli, Garibaldi, all that is like necessary. Right. So we're not just talking about socialism here. But again, it's like there are many good things. There are many bad things. I think the general historical trajectory is positive. But what stuns me about a lot of leftcom people is like, I was out there and, trying to bring the nuance, so to speak. And, people are just like, like kind of course, drinking a bit, to be fair. And they're like, I think it's one of the most monstrous and oppressive things that the world has ever seen, and I would be totally against, this is like, okay.
Well, I mean,
you're not talking about the real
structure. The excesses of the PRC are pretty unusual, right? So I think when you get into like the nitty gritty of what are the excesses of authoritarianism in the 21st century, I hesitate to use authoritarian, but in terms of just China specifically, the material mapping of brainwaves, that sort of thing, the material analysis of your prisoners as people who contain organs which could be removed and transplanted and utilized better. Those are a bit of Western propaganda as well, but it's Western propaganda because it is unusual, right? And Zizek sort of continues that critique of when, the Chinese projects in Africa, there's the setting up of infrastructure, but then there's this new ability to sort of crush dissent, right? And I think my main issues with China are going to be, you could say fairly liberal, as the classic issue with Marxism, Leninism, free speech, and then labor time of the laborers, which is high, right? But that's an Asian tendency in general. There's a general sort of high labor time.
I would say also Latin American.
In Latin America as well. How many hours do you work in a week, Ernesto?
About 50.
You work 50, okay.
Yeah.
Is that average for the factory? Is people work 50 or do people work more?
More. Yeah, I work strictly no overtime because I'm an office laborer. So I work from 8 to 6, Monday through Friday, and Saturdays I work 8 to 1. But usually floor laborers work from 8 to 10, stuff like that.
Oh wow.
Yeah, the whole thing we're talking about in the chapter, working overtime to make up for eating.
Yeah.
Which is what I want to say. Yeah.
You want to talk about how Japan made a lot of money, like post-war. It's like, look at the basic situation here. You have the organization of the conditions for the reproduction of labor in an essential way, so that Medicare is national, for example, and thus delivered in a more efficient way than the States. Then you have basically a policy of full employment, right? Then on top of that, you have very, very long, right? Working day, working week, right? So it's like if you look at a whole labor force being engaged in that way, right? And then you look at, and it's a certain fusion of government and private sector control, right? Yeah. You look at a whole labor force being engaged that way. Then you look at a long working week. Then you look at let's say efficient forms of social coverage supplementing the market. And it's you can see how they grew up, combined with their already existing industrial prehistory, right? You can see how they were very quickly built into an amazingly economic, wealthy and powerful state in that way, right?
Yeah, of course.
But absent military. So America didn't bother America, right? Because they were just building their, kind of their moral power, right, in East Asia, but they didn't risk, Japanese military independence.
Yeah.
Right. And they never would have provided that kind of support to Taiwan, Japan, Singapore, and so on, were it not for the threat of China, and its vast population as a communist state, that was a direct attempt to provide other models for development to offset what was going on there.
Yeah.
Which is why I don't like when Ben, like, we had a debate about this, and Ben was like, well, like, look at Taiwan. Haven't they done a lot of the things that the PRC did? So but they weren't communists. So would you say that's good? And it's like, well, yeah, but I don't think that, like, the allowance of a small place like Taiwan to become what it was, right, I think had very much to do with the Western support for certain regions in opposition to China.
Yeah.
So I think if you're going to talk about China, you should be comparing it to, like, India or something. A big third world mouse.
Yeah. And I was going to talk also about, like, here's a dynamic that the United States had with Japan, which is a trade ally, but it also has other trade allies, right? The whole of Latin America. And instead of having that sort of economic relationship like it had with Japan, where it shared technology and it shared, resources, instead, it immiserated the entire continent. Because, like you said, its interest in Japan was political and economic domination. Here in Latin America, it's a different kind of political and economic domination.
Well, to put it very succinctly, there's no China in Latin America.
Exactly.
Right? There's just no threat like that, right? I mean, if Brazil had become like a Soviet Union or PRC style state, I think it's much more probable that the states would have given, like, much more direct forms of assistance.
Also, they never would have allowed that.
Well, maybe so, but keep in mind that they did a lot to try to obstruct this happening in Russia and China too. Right, as did other imperialist powers.
I mean, Eliot's right. That could have happened in Latin America, but the U.S. was very diligent about not allowing it.
Yeah, I think the push, one, it's geographically closer, which is not to be underestimated, the importance of that. And two, helped by general, I think general racism, I think, also sort of expands the sort of American tendency. It's like, well, we're going to do whatever the fuck we want. Because Latin America and where,
yeah. And
China slips in through the back door, right? In a way,
yeah.
It's like, like, if you look at what happens there, it's like, well, it's kind of a weird thing. Like, even the Soviet Union had even given support to the Kuomintang, not to the Chinese communists, who they thought were more likely to win. Trotsky had protested and said, well, we should give support to the Chinese communists, not the Social Democrats. But whatever. But, to be fair, at the time they gave it to the Social Democrats, the communists were very weak. So they were just trying to support, like, a general, Republican movement and social emancipation in China to make them an ally and so on. Like, they weren't thinking that was possible, right? But then what happened is you had the war against Japan, right? And then, like, the Chinese communists and nationalists who'd been fighting each other, they formed a pact, right? And so, like, I think the West hoped that they would, like, come out, that they weren't going to oppose the pact because it was strategically necessary to fight Japan, right? And consequently the fascist bloc. But I think what they hoped was that the Social Democratic faction, Chiang Kai-shek and so on, would emerge victorious.
Yeah.
That didn't happen. But it's actually, it was only the course of a few years in which it became very visible that the communists were getting there, and they were actually, and a lot of it had to do with the fact they were more violent. Not that they were, like, exceptionally violent by world historical standards, but, like, they didn't make deals with warlords as much. They were like, they did earlier, but they didn't make as many deals with warlords and stuff. They were like, we're going to shut this down. Right. So they were very, very militant and vehement about creating the conditions for a singular republic, more so than the nationalists, who were more prone to compromise. But that eventually, brought people to their side. And, the term gung ho refers to the willingness of Chinese communists to die, in their fights against the Japanese, for example. Right. The soldiers were very, very renowned for their valor. So the Chinese communists kind of slipped through, right, the Civil War and what happens in World War II. But then the States is like, oh, shit, right? And the West is like, fuck, like, how did this happen, right? So then they try to isolate China, support everywhere around it. And, I think the UN doesn't even recognize China as the seat for China until 1976. So they actually take the government in Taiwan, tiny island, and they say, you're China, not the People's Republic of China. The Republic of China is what it was called. They treat that as the diplomatic representation for, like, the world's most populous state until, like, the 70s. That's how anti-China they were. And that's really until you get, like, Nixon and the normalization of relations.
Conrad, is free speech then a bourgeois concern?
Well, I mean, you have to ask yourself the question of who's speaking, right? Like, it's not an abstract thing, right? So it's like, I think the thing is, like, when you're trying to build a republic, every republic's founded in violence, right? Sure. And when you've got all these multifarious elements, like, the French Republic, the American Republic, the Italian Republic, like, it was Garibaldi's military campaign. He wasn't going around being like, do you guys want to be part of the Italian Republic? you know, you have to create like an actual people, right, who are on the same page civically and infrastructurally in a lot of ways. Then I think free speech is a luxury that can be allotted at that point. Because otherwise you're just going to be completely torn to shreds. And we see this time and time again in the third world. You know, this is the problem. Like in India, it's like, yeah, okay, you're right to have the caste system. It's like, what kind of fucking right is that? Like, it's like a horrific, you know, racially alienating institution. And in spite of all these very thorough affirmative action campaigns, they still haven't erased the impact of that at all. You know, that's not a right.
Government. So the nationalist government bolsters old systems like the caste system.
Modi and stuff. Yeah, but this is an old problem because Gandhi himself said we'd keep the caste system. But he's like, we'll keep the caste system, we'll get rid of the lowest class. Which, like, you know, I can only imagine what Marx would have wrote lowest caste. I can only imagine what Marx would have written about that if he'd lived through it. We'll keep the stratification, but we'll get rid of the lowest one. Right? It's like, okay. But it still exists.
You know, the ideal of getting rid of, but you don't, like, what does that mean? It doesn't really mean much.
Yeah, well, it doesn't, especially when you maintain all the other forms of stratification. It continues. Now, they did do a lot, like in terms of affirmative action, but that's done in an identitarian basis. So part of the problem you get with this is like, people are like, oh, they're just giving all these advantages to people from lower case, right? And Piketty analyzes this in Capital and Ideology, and he says like it would have been India probably would have been better off if they just like abolished these systems and created like universal social programming rather than trying to have identity targeted, like in Vietnam or Bangladesh or China. So again, and this gets us to why Adolf Reed is saying about Black Lives Matter, right? Why he's saying like you have to put it in a class context as well, right? Because you can't just say, well, it's just like psychological racism or it's just racism, right? It's connected. That may have certain independent effects on the structure of reality, but it's connected to a much larger matrix. Even if we look at levels of police favorability, right? Who hates the police, right? It's like poor people, Black people, young people, right? What do they have in common? Guess, right? I mean, so, and then Adolf Reed was banned by the DSA, of course. They canceled him because he was...
What do they have all in common? Poor people, Black people, young people.
Well, they're all poor, right?
Poor people. I mean, poor people are also poor people.
Well, yeah, they're connected. Yeah, they're connected to the experience of poverty culturally, even if they're not poor, they're culturally connected to the experience of poverty in the sense they're surrounded by people who are or more sensitive to it. But this is why. Okay. We don't have to get into the problematics of saying. Of your universalization of Black people as poor. We don't have to. No, I mean more statistically disposed to poverty. That's all. I mean.
More there you go.
Yeah. There's the.
I'm not saying all Black people are poor. That's not my thing. But yeah. So, and this is what I like what Ben said about this. Because, I mean, yeah. So Adolf Reed was canceled by the DSA because he was accused of promulgating quote class reductionism. And Ben did a video about this and he's like, what is class reductionism? Because like, there may be people like on Reddit, I don't know, who believe that, but like, there's no Marxist who's actually saying like, yeah, we don't need to care about race. Yeah. Like, nobody says that.
Even the racists care about race in their racist way. Right?
Yeah. But there's no Marxist who's saying that like racial struggle doesn't have a great importance. That's not the point. Right, like, and Adolf Reed isn't saying like racial struggle, is pointless. He's pointing to what he perceives as an ideological defect within BLM that risks it being reabsorbed by the Democratic Party. And he talks about how this is like particularly.
I would say it's actually absorbed by the Democratic Party.
Yeah,
there's no if. I mean, the Democratic Party is going to consistent. Black Lives Matter. They're signing up voters to register. They don't because it's like what else to do.
Well, and you see, like
what I talk about in the book, by the way, in terms of there is no resolution, to eliminate the idea of a resolution of history, and these fantasy kind of things appear. The ideal turns into the actual the actual for Black Lives Matter is, I would say, democratic. The Democratic Party bolstering. It's not a third party. I mean, you get that, or you get like sort of just defund the police, which is outside the Democratic Party to a large extent as well. But they're both actualized. So anti-Democratic Party and Democratic Party, the ultimate function is it does help. It does help the Democratic Party.
I think you see a constitutive ambivalence in it, right? And I think the ambivalence goes to the fact that like a lot of the activists out with BLM are young Black activists. So if you look at Black voters in the Democratic primary, for example, right? We know they were very, very important. South Carolina obviously starting to Biden, beating Sanders. On the other hand, right, if you look at the fact that it's younger Black voters, there was a stronger tendency to move toward like the socialist side in that demographic.
Yeah.
So if you look at the kind of coalition between Antifa, whatever types, and whatever. And
no, you said it. You said it right, but that's how the Southern.
No, I just mean like whatever that means, and certain BLM activists. I think that coalition is made possible because of that ambivalence. But I also think this is why interventions like Reed's are actually important. I mean, he talks about the specific significance of the like racial monocausality to like middle class Black professionals in particular, right? It was very interesting. Like, there is like, I posted some stuff by Adolph Reed and all that, and there's a girl I know from Texas. She's Black from Texas, great, really nice person. It was interesting, right? Because like I posted some of this stuff and she deleted me, and then like, I'm kind of like, but then she is part of this professional managerial class as well, right?
Okay.
So this is what I mean.
What did you post that got you deleted?
I don't know. Maybe it was like, I think I'm speculating because I don't know why this would have happened. I'm just speculating, but I think maybe it was like, could be totally bullshit, but I think maybe it was like about the destruction of the labor HQ in Washington, which I did, thought was very dubious. Yeah. Or maybe some of the things Adolph Reed was writing about. So I'm not sure exactly, but I mean, I criticize.
Tired of your beard, Conrad.
Sorry,
it's a very nice beard. I was saying maybe she just got tired of your beard.
It could be, yeah, totally possible. I also, by the way, I've also criticized reparations a little bit, like as a policy approach.
Oh yeah, that I could do it.
Yeah, which could be, not because I don't support giving money to those communities effectively, but again, it's just in terms of a strong defense of universal programming. I mean, when you start just,
you also don't know. Like I say, like the fantasy. This is the problem with the ideals or the nature of sort of these ideas is there's so many forces at work here in terms of, and they all sort of reappear, and there is a sort of racial force, and a leftist force, and then you do sort of, if you're Black in America and someone brings up the idea of reparations, you're not going to go like, well, I don't know if you can, like, you might, but if you're certainly if you're a socialist activist, the tendency, even if you kind of think it's like iffy, I don't think you're going to counter somebody who's within your movement and within your racial minority sort of group that you're trying to have solidarity with. You're not going to be like, oh, that's BS.
Well, yeah, but what I support is effective reparations anyway, right? But what I mean to say is like, so Jacobin or something won't say that, but I'm not taking like mass political positions when I'm talking about, nor is like Adolph Reed or whoever, when they're opining, in their capacity as intellectuals, right? They may be influenced by those concerns, but there's an effort to provide a particular perspective.
Yeah. Plus the black political class in America is, just as divided as the white political classes. You get essentially like a chauvinistic kind of right-wing aspect, but is actually kind of recaptured by left-wing revolutionary sentiments. You get the intersectional kind of type people. You get your sort of general democratic people that, and I think one of the issues is, one of the sentiments is, I think with the white imaginary, which is the white imaginary of what can we do, is there's a large pushback against that. I would say universally, that sort of attitude of the white savior attitude, and then how to react to that, I think is like a big ground of a lot of of a lot of the divides between like that prevent access, you could say, or cause sort of discord between what you could say is a well-meaning leftist socialist such as yourself and myself or Ernesto. No, really, because there's a real question in LA with Black activism. It's like, can Black and Brown really get along? And that is hugely thrown into question.
We weren't slaves, so there's that difference.
Yeah, and there's the racism against Black Americans in the Mexican community. in America, and there is a big divide in terms of like you'll get like people that are KKK level really versus people who are not like that, and that own sort of conflict. And I especially after the Black Lives Matter protests, the divide is becoming more clear. And I think the younger generation is actually who I think before the protests, actually, I see in the Mexican community in Los Angeles were kind of ambivalent politically, are moving left.
Good.
Like, and I rarely say that's happening because I'm normally like, nothing's fucking moving left. Everything. But I do actually see the younger Mexican generation through the Black Lives Matter protests. A lot of people who I know are apolitical, sort of moving towards leftist ideas, and it's like, how can I be more politically involved? And that's sort of becoming a theme.
Well, you see a split, right, in those communities. It's really interesting. Like, I have a friend who's Latina Jewish from New Mexico, and she was telling me about how in New Mexico they're having all these battles about the statues of a conquistador. Juan de, I don't know how to pronounce this. Juan de Onate or something. I don't know. He's got a little squiggle above the end. How do I do that? Do you know?
Enye.
Yeah. Okay. Juan de Enye. Okay.
Ni.
How do I do that? How do you do that?
Ni.
Juan de Enye.
Enye. Yeah.
Okay. And he so he was a conquistador.
And what's the name of the guy? Juan de.
It's Onate, but there's like a little squiggle above the end. Yeah, it's in New Mexico.
Oh, sorry, Oñate.
Oñate.
Yeah. Juan de Oñate.
Yeah. So he was like this guy, and he was like this, I don't know, he's like some explorer, and he like raped and killed a lot of people. I think he had slaves or something, really, whatever. And it's like you have this split in the Hispanic community in New Mexico, because you have some people who, there's an internal debate in the community, but we're moving his statues, because you have some people who are like, oh, he's representative of us Hispanophones. We shouldn't be removing like images of ourselves in like a white, very white society. And then you have another side that's like, well, we're actually mixed indigenous, and like, he committed genocide, right, against indigenous people, and was this like generally incompetent and horrible person. So you see the different vectors of Latin American identity or being manifest, right, in this kind of conflict, right? And then I think this is sort of about, Eliot, what you're saying about this. We talked about it in the Black community with Biden and Sanders, but you can also see,
well, not just Biden and Sanders. Like it can't be expressed through Democratic.
No. Yeah, there's an even more radical.
It's like, well, it's not even radical necessarily. I think there's like a more chauvinistic, not even chauvinistic to a certain extent. Yeah, that gets recaptured by the Democratic Party at times, but is largely differentiated from it, and it can get recaptured by the right wing as well. And then there's your more sort of socialist Black activists, you could say. But I would say the tendency is when there is a social movement, there is this large divide, because I think whiteness itself, the problem is you can look at like this through Hegelian unity. Whiteness and the main symbolic order of the U.S. are seen as one and the same. So to exit the symbolic order, or to go against, you could say law, or the mechanisms of electoralism, is to also go against sort of the white supremacist, and just supremacists based on quantity, the 75% white country that is the U.S. To exit out of that imposition. So you don't. So it's very complex. I try to navigate it in terms of just knowing, trying to know the Geist that is Black America better, because in terms of like helping, I always think of what Malcolm says is like, what can I do? Nothing, or just shut the fuck up. So I think mostly I am trying to just sort of understand it. And then, this is me being in South LA and part of Black community in South LA for a couple years now. Just trying to understand at this point.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this is interesting, because with the statues, like in this whole this articulation within Latin American identity or U.S. Hispanic identity, or we're already like amalgamating categories in ways we probably shouldn't. But okay.
Yeah, I've heard so many things about this.
Yeah, Latina or Latine. Or,
I think Latinx is mostly accepted by the left, but I know a particular.
What do you mean by the left? It's like the activist left in the States.
Activist left.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's tiny. I don't know if you've ever looked. They polled
Yeah, I heard some people.
in the United States, and it was like 3% of Hispanics in the United States said they liked the term or something.
Well, I think they said identify with the term, which is different than like the term.
Yeah, sure.
I know
it's also kind of a weird thing.
I know my friend who describes himself now on Twitter as the poet laureate of BLM, although he's Mexican. He has this idea that he's going to do this. But I know that when he saw that appear in, say, Boyle Heights, he was like, this is going to isolate the community. Like, what are you even doing? Who are these people who are putting Latinx on these doors by me to sell things? Ultimately, it was to sell things. So.
I mean, I'm sorry, like maybe this is just my own internalized prejudice or whatever, but like when I read Latinx in an article, I just inherently take the article less seriously than before. I mean, part of it is just how ridiculous it is. You have a language that's entirely gender stratified. So like you think the solution is just like coming up with the term like inks, like which is really unnatural seeming in terms of how it's kind of grafted on there. But I mean, there's a really fundamental problem of linguistic like normativity ingrained.
I can tell you how that's played out here in Mexico if you're interested.
Tell us, yeah.
Yeah. So we had two different bands, right? Well, three different bands here. You have the conservatives who argue for a very okay. Someone's asking if they can join. Yeah, Nestor. Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
Yeah.
Wait, should I send Nestor the link?
Yeah, please.
We got some more Latinx people coming in here.
Yeah. Let me give Nestor.
I think Nestor is Latinx, isn't he?
Yeah, he is.
He's
Latinx. Yeah. So okay.
Nestor,
is it Latinx? Is it like LAX or is it like Latinx? Anyway.
Yeah. No, we just add the vowel. Yeah, instead of the X, we just say E or A.
Oh, so what are you saying? Tell us about Mexico.
Okay, right. So there's three bands, right? There's the conservatives and the royalists or whatever who are very adherent to the fact that, just as you said, Spanish is a gendered language. And that is how it's formally structured. And if you add something else, it's a neologism, right? Mm. But there's then the other two sides who agree that neologisms are fine. And if we want to make up new words, we can make up new words and just use new words and whatever the fuck, And it's a very popular position. I understand that in the US, it's a very fringe position, but here, because it's the national language, it is a thing. And it's also a very feminist position because it's gendered, as you know, in the masculine, right? Like the neutral in Mexico is masculine.
Same in French,
Yeah. Because there are other countries where the neutral is neutral, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, well, okay. So I'm not actually, to be clear, I'm not against like changing the language. My argument wasn't for like linguistic purity. My argument, it was just criticizing the triviality of and the artificiality of Latinx, like as an idea. Like I would support like a more fundamental, and in France, they have the Institut de la Langue Française or whatever. I would support like a more fundamental restructuration of the language.
So Conrad,
I feel like these debates can distract from that need as well.
So Conrad, we have our guest here, Nestor. So Nestor wanted to say something. What's up, Nestor? How's it going?
Oh yeah, what's up, guys? Pretty good. Actually, like I don't know what Ernesto said just right now because I was, like switching from the Facebook Live to like the actual stream thing. So maybe I'm gonna like repeat something that he said.
Just go for it.
That's fine.
But yeah, so what's really interesting, like talking to like Hispanics and in the United States, I find it really interesting because I mean, people in Mexico, like kind of like left-wing activists, which I think was kind of what Ernesto was saying, do tend to be like, in favor of using like X, or sometimes people here use like an E because like an E is kind of considered neutral instead of like O or A, right? And then, I think the other thing is like conservatives are like, no, you have to preserve the language, whatever, like you can't just like butcher the language and change like gendered nouns to like an X or whatever, right?
Well, the activist space is not the place for, right? There's a sort of impossibility of making the activist space place for critique of activist sort of linguistics like the Latinx, like where there's really no space to do that.
Yeah, but what I find
well, this is like an analysis education space, not necessarily.
But what I find like super like kind of weird and interesting is that at least like the kind of left-wing activists who are like, you know, Hispanic but from the United States that I talk to, they are like super against the use of like Latinx, because they say like, oh, if you use Latinx, that's kind of like that's like colonializing the Spanish language with English, and kind of like admitting that like English is superior because it's gender neutral already. So if you use, you know, like we use like Latino and Latina because like that's the way Spanish is, and like that's our language and whatever, and like, you know, just because it's not gender neutral doesn't mean it's like
so
inferior to English
like
and whatever.
Anglicizes it a bit. Like the hidden fantasy is not the gender neutral thing, which that's the problem, and that's, you know, why Freudian sort of understanding is so important in terms of the fantasy of overcoming gender meets with the reality that there's something outside, which is Anglican gender neutrality, and which is then further attached to Anglican imperialism.
Yeah. Okay, but this is already. Can I just say this is already a bit of a pseudo discourse, because like it seems to me that the
pseudo discourse. This is a great discourse.
No, I'm not criticizing you. What I'm trying to say about this is like,
what do you say about discourse?
The impulse toward gender neutrality, I think you have to understand within the context of you know, the development of capitalism, right? And the challenge that it issues to certain patriarchal structures, right? In terms of the universalization of the sale of labor power. So if you're making it about English versus Spanish, I feel like in a way you're missing the problematic.
No, I think because I think you're missing a certain fundamental nature of the human psyche in terms of why people reject it, right?
Okay, well, I agree. I'm not saying they don't reject it for that reason. I'm just saying that I think it would be better to look at the real structure, is what I mean. That's
the thing, and this is why you might critique my book, which is this is the real actual structure which prevents maybe changes that you want to see instituted.
It's a real abstraction. That's what we say, right? But Nestor, did you have something to add? Sorry.
No, yeah, I was like, I just wanted to compare like how like the Hispanic like left-wing activists see that in comparison to like left-wing activists like in Mexico, for example, because since like activists in Mexico, or like I guess just like Latin America in general, don't have this like thing of English as a referent, then like it never even crosses their mind that like trying to make Spanish gender neutral is like, you know, like colonializing or whatever, right? Because like Spanish is actually like the colonial language in some sense, right?
Yeah, that's true.
When compared to like yeah. So for them it's just like, yeah, I mean like this is already the colonial language. It doesn't matter like if we make it gender neutral or whatever. It's not like
we don't care myself, you know. So
sorry?
Yeah, so it's I don't know, it's pretty interesting how just like having another language in relation to your own like changes that dynamic of like whether you know you want to make it gender neutral or not. And like I'm sure like the people who are like vehemently against using Latinx in the United States, and the people who are like vehemently in favor of actually using the like, you know, the X in Mexico or other Spanish speaking countries would agree on like pretty much like everything else, right? It's just like the context makes it so that this one particular thing.
Yeah, but these like sort of fantasy ideas which seem like not important. Which I argue extensively in my upcoming book, The Ego in its Hyperstate, is the problem is the way that things appear actually in the world is these fantasy Latinx discussions and things like that, which then push forward the history which can actualize in law and actualize in state.
Something that I think is very important to the actual Latin American context is that a lot of our indigenous tribes weren't in a strict gender binary, right? So
Yes.
Latin America, yeah. Sorry.
No. I was just saying like, yeah, that's true. That some Latin American people,
So like you say, Nestor, our reaction to this colonial imposition, to this very prosthetic existence and identity for native people in general, it's we don't mind fighting against it, and we don't mind wanting to change it, because for us, Spanish, while dominating and shaping our culture and our thoughts, it's very, like, I understand that all language is alien, but Spanish in specific is very alien to Americans.
Can I just say, so I think oh, sorry, Nestor, continue.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I just want to say that I think, it helps to, in terms of like, if you think of, because you're talking about what Marx would have, if you're talking about like tribal indigenous communities, you're talking about what Marx, may have called, depending on the level of agricultural development, like primitive communism. Right?
Yeah.
And so, there's a connection that is implicit in Marx's organization of the modes of production, of the way that like the abolition of feudal patriarchal like ideal relations within capitalism, and even like the liberal abstractions that accompany that actually prepare the basis, right? Or prepare the ground, right? For the succession of communism. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think that, what you have to say is that the abstractions characteristic of liberal capitalist modernity, like when it comes to the elimination of these gender distinctions, are decidedly preferable to the abstractions of 16th century colonialism or something like that.
Yeah, definitely.
So that would be my Nestor, do you have any thoughts on that?
I wouldn't, like, when I said like earlier, I was just agreeing with Ernesto. So yeah, but I think you're right.
Okay. Do we have anything?
Yeah.
We've been 2 hours. Is
Yeah,
there
we're
more?
at 2 hours. Should we all sign off? We could.
Yeah.
I don't want to disappoint Nestor. I know he hopped on. Have you said everything you wanted to say?
Yeah, I think pretty much. Like, I just wanted to hop on because of like the Latinx thing, which I thought was pretty interesting. But yeah.
Okay.
All right.
So I think we can all agree that we're pro changing languages, but anti Band-Aid. Should be a real change.
Yeah.
Real change. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I hope to give the socialist left back these sort of things, which are now seen as basically neoliberal obfuscations, because it's not quite only a neoliberal obfuscation or abstraction. I hope it, like, I think they are, because they are actually present in the world. So and they have a cause, and they have a force to them, and then I think they do have this dual force of sort of obfuscate. You could see, like, in terms of they serve as a replacement for things within capitalist capitalist companies. I was going to say, and, to obfuscate actual justice. But in terms of within the activist community, they have a second sort of binding role. But I think the key would to be to not antagonize the activists so much, because they're not quite the same thing as the rainbow capitalist coalition, you could say.
Oh yeah.
There's actually, I was going to say that there's actually a lot of more nuance to this whole Latinx discussion in Latin America, but I think we can leave it for some other time.
Yeah.
And I just want to say too, I think it's very important, like here, because like, part of, because I think what we're trying to do is kind of build like a left of the left, or like an internal critique of the left. And, Zizek just wrote an article and he said, like, why aren't people like Sanders or Thurnberg very visible in this moment? He said, like, it's because they're not radical enough to capture the current geist, right? And I think this also means discussing the fundamental organization of our world linguistically, temporally, and so on. So again, like I put up a meme about how recently in the group about how, in the French Revolution, they reorganized the calendar metrically. We're like, okay, before Christ is before Common Era, which is, obviously a Band-Aid. So I think here it's, this to me is a parallel with the discussion about Latinx, not Latinx, as I said before, because I think, it's like we have to renew that kind of ambition, right, that the left has had at its best of times, to make it respond to the opening and the space of possibility of the current moment.
Yeah. On that note, should we sign off? That's a good.
Sure. And by the way, guys, check out Nestor's articles. He's one of our great left voices today. I read his article he wrote on republicanism and the connection with socialism in Marion West. I was really, really impressed, and I'm very much of that persuasion. So yeah, check his stuff out too.
Oh, thanks.
Okay, we sign off.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Nestor.
Bye.
Yeah.
Do the thing.
Sorry, that was a bit of I can't help.
Right.
All right, we're signing off. Bye, everybody.
Sign off.
Still got my thumbs stuck. How long are gonna make this pose?
And hop on.
Jesus.
We got like Team Rocket style poses. This is great.
Last thing? Yeah. All right. Ending broadcast.
All right.
Yeah.